The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences awarded the Sveriges Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in the memory of Alfred Nobel for 2024 to three US-based economists. One is Darren Acemoglu, second is Simon Johnson, and third is James A. Robinson. Now, this research, which they have done, highlighted the fundamental question and tried to answer the fundamental question that has intrigued economists for several decades. And the question is why there are some nations who are rich and why there are some nations who are poor. What is the difference and why some nations become richer and richer and why some nations are devastated and becoming poorer and poorer by passing of time. Now, their research primarily focuses on the impact of societal institutions on economic prosperity in a particular nation, in a particular country. Now, also they explored different frameworks which are governing the human behavior and which can lead to significant disparities in wealth amongst different nations. Now, what is the whole study all about? What is its analysis? And all the other details which you need to know in relation to this Nobel Prize in Economics 2024, we'll be trying to understand in this particular session. Hello, you're watching Perspective. My name is Preetpal Singh, and today's topic is Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences 2024.
Prestigious Nobel Prizes for the year 2024 were announced last week. Darren Acemoglu, Simon Johnson and James A. Robinson for their research into differences in prosperity between nations.
Now, officially, it is not known as Nobel Prize in Economics. Officially, it is known as Sveriges Riksbank Prize of Economic Sciences, which is in memory of Alfred Nobel, which was established in 1968. It is not a part of the original Nobel Prizes, which were established in the 1895 by the will of Alfred Nobel. Rather, it was created by the Swedish Central Bank to honor the Alfred Nobel's legacy in economic sciences domain. The prize amount is 11 million Swedish kronor, which is to be distributed amongst the laureates equally. And this prize is primarily to honor the laureates who has done significant research in relation to economic sciences discipline and economic sciences field throughout the world. Now let us try to understand the research done by these three Nobel laureates and analyze it in a great detail. Now, first thing, we have made very clear in the introduction part itself that their research primarily focused on the importance of societal institutions in relation to a country's prosperity, primarily economic prosperity. Now, they have tried to help us understand the difference between prosperity of different nations and understand that why prosperity differs between nation to nation. Now, societies with the poor rule of law and poor institutions, they exploit the population and they do not generate growth or change for better. And these laureates' research helps us understand why does this happen. And again, the big question still remains that why are some countries or some nations rich and why other remains poor? And why do some nations fail? And why do some other nations, they succeed in achieving prosperity? All these questions definitely have puzzled the economists for several decades. But these three Nobel laureates, they've tried to find answers of these three primary questions. Now let us take a step back and try to understand the research. Over the years, many explanations have been put forward, whether it be demographic, whether it be geographical, whether it be climatic or evolution based, as to the reason why some nations are more prosperous than the others. Of course, many nations who are relatively poor today weren't so in the past. Earlier, they might be very, very rich, but today, in today's time, they are poor. So the particular answer which we are trying to give also depends on what time period we are considering while we are analyzing the question. However, the question still remains very, very relevant. And as these Nobel laureates have pointed out in their research, that richest 20% of the world's nations are now 30 times more rich than the poorest 20% of the nations, which is a very startling fact to know. And this shows that the income gap or the wealth gap between the richest and the poorest of the nations, it is constant, it is persistent and has been growing as the years are passing away. Although one thing is clear, that the poorer countries, they have become relatively richer, but they are not catching up with most of the other prosperous countries. Now the question is why? And to answer this question, this year's Nobel laureates, they have presented the framework on societal institutions, that how societal institutions are impacting the country's prosperity. Now let us first try to understand what is the societal institution. So they say, these Nobel laureates, laureates that societal institutions are any set of laws or any set of rules that governs the behavior of individuals in a society or in a country. So societies with a poor rule of law and poor set of institutions, they exploit the population and they do not generate growth or change for any good. Also, these laureates, they distinguished institutions between two. One is inclusive institution, another is extractive institution. Now, according to them, an inclusive institution is one where democracy is existing, law and order is there is protection of property rights, and all the things are going on in an orderly manner. However, an extractive institution framework typically refers to lack of rule of law. Also, power being concentrated in few hands. That means kind of a dictatorship or a autocracy as well, and kind of a exploitative institutional setup. So we see both of these institutions, that is inclusive and extractive, they are polar opposites to each other. And these opposite institutional frameworks, they lead to very different incentives for the people in that particular economy or societal setup. Now let's take an example of property. Let's say people are assured that their property will not be taken away at will, or their incomes or their profits which they are earning will be protected for generations to come. They will tend to focus more on long-term growth rather than parochial short-term vision. Also, it will lead to long-term prosperity also. But on the other hand, if the absence of inclusive institutional framework is there, the incentives, they collapse for the people, and it will undermine the long-term prosperity for the people also and for the whole nation as well. This is one logic. Now you would question that what is the available evidence to show this? This is a statement sounding very good, but what is the actual evidence? And also the question is, how do we know that the causality factors is flowing from the existence of institutions to economic prosperity and not the other way around? That are institutions leading to economic prosperity, or it's the other way around, that is economic prosperity is leading to better social institutions? How do we know what is what? And moreover, how can we be so certain that there is definitely a cause and effect relationship between the two? And moreover, rich countries and poor countries, they are different from each other in different other ways as well, not just in the type of institutions they have. And these differences in turn could affect both the institutions as well as the economic growth also. Now to answer this question, the Nobel laureates of 2024, they examined the European colonialism in large parts of the world, and they summarized their findings in a very important paper, that is the Colonial Origins of Comparative Development and Empirical Investigation. And this was first published in the American Economic Review in the year 2001. And they found one very important explanation for the cultural differences in the prosperity. And they said the main reason was the political and economic systems that the colonizers introduced and the countries they chose to retain it. So if we talk about this more precisely, these researchers, they found out that in some colonies where the purpose of the institutions was to exploit the indigenous population, to extract the natural resources, to exploit them maximum, and to benefit the colonizers as maximum as possible, while in other cases, the same set of colonizers, they built an inclusive framework, inclusive political and social system, which is better for the long-term settlement of European settlers. Also, the laureates, they explained a very important phenomena during this period of time. That was reversal of fortune. So what they highlighted was that the places, relatively speaking, who were richest at the point of time of colonization are now amongst the poorest. In addition, they used also mortality figures for the colonizers amongst other things, and they did find a relationship. That is, the higher the mortality amongst the colonizers at that point of time, the lower per capita GDP of that nation is today. And the question is why? And the answer is that the settlers' mortality, that is the colonizers' mortality, that means how dangerous it was to colonize an area, affected the type of institutions being set up in that area. And it depended on the level of mortality that would the colonizers be setting up an inclusive institution or an extractive institution, and that is where the whole prosperity got shaped. So now let us see the bigger picture, that how this seeds of colonization and how these traces of colonial institutions are impacting the present day world and present day countries. So in their work, to describe it in a better way, these laureates, they use the example of city of Nogales, which is at the border between US and Mexico. Now, this is basically a tale of two cities which has been divided. So city is one, that is Nogales city, and it is cut in half by a fence between Mexico and US. If you stand on the fence and you look north, Nogales, Arizona, USA you can see, and it stretches out ahead of you. So in the northern part, it is the USA Nogales. Now in this part, The residents, they are relatively very well off. They're having higher average lifespans. Their most children, they receive high school diplomas. Property rights are secure in that particular area. And people know that they will be enjoying the benefits from their investments as well. And there are free and fair elections. And the residents, they get an opportunity to replace the politicians with whom they are not satisfied at all. So there are inclusive institutions which are built in that particular area. And if you look southwards, that is Nogales, which is there in Mexico, you will find the polar opposite. Though it is relatively a wealthy part of Mexico, but as compared to US Nogales, it is not very well developed. Organized crimes are very common in that area. Companies are running on a lot of risk. Corrupt politicians are very difficult to remove in that area as well. But the question is that two halves of the same city, why are they having different economic prosperity and why are there differential outcomes in both the cities? City is one, but the halves are two. In the northern belt of the city, why it is so prosperous? In the southern belt, why is it not very prosperous? Geographically, they are in the same place. Also, the factors like climate, they are exactly the same. Also, the two populations, they are having similar origins also, and historically the northern area was actually in Mexico. So long-term residents of the city, they have common ancestors as well. And more importantly, there are so many cultural similarities between the two also. People eat more or less the same type of food and they listen to more or less same kind of music also on both the sides of the fence. So besides so much similarity existing, why the decisive factor is not geography, not culture, but institutions. And that is what the research highlights, that the decisive factor is not the culture, it is not the climate, but it is the type of institutions which were developed in both the halves. The people who are living in the northern part of the city, they are more prosperous because they are living under the USA economic system, which gives them greater opportunities as compared to the southern part. Greater opportunities in relation to education are there, greater opportunities in relation to prosperity and profession are there. And they are also part of USA political system also, which gives them important political rights as well. However, the fortune is not the same in the southern side of the fence. They live under other economic conditions where the political system is not very good and they can't influence legislations in a very great way. And that is why it is relatively less prosperous, because the institutions set up in the southern part of the area, they are not very well developed. And the Nobel laureates, they point out one very important thing, that this city is not an exception, that we are putting up an exception and we are analyzing it and then we are making a universal theory. That is not the case. These Nobel laureates suggested that it is a clear pattern which can be seen in different other colonies also. And this all goes back to the colonial legacy and colonial times, where European colonizers, they went to different part of the world and they colonized different areas. So what really happened was, when these European colonizers, they were trying to colonize different parts of the world, the existing institutions, sometimes they changed very dramatically, but it was not the same in each of the cases and it was not same everywhere. In colonies where the purpose was to exploit the people and the purpose was to extract maximum from the indigenous people and maximum benefit for the colonizers, the institutions are set up in a different way. However, compared to colonies where they gave social political rights, the institution was set up in a different way. And one very important factor which influence the type of colony that will be developed will be the population density, which we have already discussed. The denser the indigenous population, the greater the resistance could be affected and the greater would be the mortality, as we saw earlier. And if greater is the mortality, the colonizers would be tend. The colonizers will basically be motivated and induced to form an extractive institutional setup. But where they will get less resistance, where the population is less dense and the chances of mortality of the colonizers are also low, in that case they'll be willing to set up more inclusive institutions, which gives them social and political participation and social and political rights also. And this same effect can be understood with the example of India also, that what happened with India under the British rule. Now the research highlighted that in the mid 18th century, in India, the industrial production was much higher as compared to United States of America. And this has changed fundamentally since the start of 19th century, after the advent of 19th century. And this shows that the reversal, that now US is more industrially prosperous and India is not that much industrially prosperous as compared to US, this reversal shows that it was a result of difference in the institutions which were set up by the colonizers. The technical innovations sweeping across the whole world were only able to take place in places or in institutions which have been established that would benefit the wider population. That means inclusive institutions being established. And now again a logical question would be that why did colonizers choose one set of rules and regulations for some colonies and different set of rules and regulations for others? And the answer we have already discussed. The answer was mortality. That is the chance of resistance in that particular area, and the threat to the colonizers of dying because of resistance. Where the threat was more, they established extractive institutions. Where the threat was less, they established inclusive institutions. So in India, where the population was more dense, they established extractive institutions. In US, where the population was more sparse and the lower resistance was expected, they established inclusive institutions. That is basically the fulcrum of their study. And all of this, it influenced the political and economic system which were developed in these areas. Also, one more thing is there. When there were few colonizers, they took over or established extractive institutions that focused on benefiting the local elite at the expense of the wider population. There were no elections. Political rights were also limited. However, in colonies where there were so many colonizers, that means settled colonies were more, they needed to have inclusive social institutions as they incentivized the settlers to work hard and invest in their new homeland. So that is also one causal relationship. And in turn, this led to them demanding political rights, and which gave them the share of the profits also. And of course, the earlier European colonies were not the so-called democracies which we see in the current world. But compared to the densely populated colonies where only few Europeans moved, the settler colonies, they provided considerably more extensive political rights. So that is basically we are trying to compare India and US. So US extensive political rights were granted even when US was a colony, and in India not such a large expanse of political rights were granted because it was densely populated. However, there is one very big critique to it. So what happened was that in 2013, soon after the release of Acemoglu and Robinson's book that was titled Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity and Poverty, there was one person who criticized it and countered it. That person was Arvind Subramaniam, who later went on to become India's chief economic advisor as well. He wrote an article on American interest, and he argued that neither China nor India, they are fitting this particular narrative. They gave the reasoning that China has grown very, very rich despite not having any inclusive institution, while India has barely grown, notwithstanding all of its inclusive institutions at place. And together, these institutions account for 1/3 of the humanity. And also, Arvind Subramaniam noted in his counter, China's growth increase is just a matter of the past 3 decades, and India's growth or India can achieve its economic potential in the next 3 decades as well. And this article basically tried to show that this research might not stand true in some cases of India and China if we do it in a comparative way. Now, since we have understood in great detail about the research and what the analysis say, on Monday what happened was Darren Acemoglu in his interview was asked about the state of institutions currently in US and the rest of the world, and he said that if you look at the data which is collected by the international organizations like Freedom House, VDEM, that is Variety of Democracies, or others, he tells that this data shows that institutions everywhere in the world are getting weaker and weaker. And he also said that if you look at the data of surveys that are asking people of their views on authoritarianism, dictatorship and democracy, he says that the views on democracy are at an all-time low.
If you look at data, and I've actually written about this, support for democracy is at an all-time low.
And he also said that according to him, he thinks that democracy is going through a rough patch currently in the world. And he said that it is very crucial and critical to gain a higher ground of a better and cleaner governance and delivering the promise of democracy to a broad range of people. That is what he has to say in one of the interviews. Now, if you have analyzed the research very clearly, you must have heard of one term, that was reversal of fortune. I would like to highlight the term to you and make you understand about that in a great detail. See, it is very simple. It means that the parts of the colonized world that were relatively more prosperous around 500 years ago are now relatively very poor. So if we look at urbanization as a measure of prosperity, this was greater in Mexico under the Aztecs than in some parts of the Northern America, that is today Canada and USA. And the reason is that in the poorest and most sparsely populated areas, European colonizers, they introduced inclusive institutions that could promote long-run prosperity. However, in the richest and the most densely populated areas like Mexico, the colonizers, the European colonizers, they introduced extractive institutions for the local populations which were less likely to lead any prosperity. Now, this model, which we have already discussed in great detail about, it has helped a lot in understanding about the democratization process in Western Europe in the end of 19th century and in the early 20th century as well. In Great Britain, adult suffrage was expanded in several stages, each of which was preceded with several strikes, several protests, and widespread protest as well. Also, the British elite, they failed to credibly meet the demands of the then social and political class, and they were in a way forced to share the power. The situation in Sweden was also somewhat similar, where the decisions on general suffrage in December of 1918 was made after extensive writing in the wake of the Russian Revolution at that point of time. So this model has also been used to show and to demonstrate why certain countries are having alternative between democracy and non-democracy. And it is also used to show that why it is difficult for countries to achieve growth for those who are not having inclusive institutions vis-a-vis those who do have inclusive institutions. And also one more thing, that why ruling elites can sometimes benefit from blocking new technologies to come up. So all these three Nobel laureates, that is Darren Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, James Robinson, they have contributed very significantly in the innovative research and what affects the country's prosperity, and they've tried to know the reason that why some countries they have remained poor, why some countries have become prosperous, and why there is reversal of fortune also since the last 500 years. So their empirical research have highlighted and demonstrated a very fundamental importance of the type of political and social institution which should be developed in a country for the future. See, because the type of social and political institution we develop in a country right now will decide the fate of the country in the coming few decades, in the coming few centuries. Again, if we have to get some insight from this research, this would be the insight, that the type of social institution, political institution we develop today will decide the fate of our country tomorrow. So we need to develop an inclusive set of political institutions and social institutions. And this work of these Nobel laureates is definitely a masterpiece and a breakthrough in both economics and political science studies as well. I hope you gain new perspective from this session. All the very best. Have a beautiful day. Thank you.